This move opens lines for the queen and bishop, controls the center, and initiates one of the most popular and strategically rich opening systems in chess. This move initiates the Pirc defense, aiming to fianchetto the king's bishop to g7 to control the long diagonal and prepare for a flexible, counter-attacking game. By playing d4, white establishes central pawn control and opens diagonals for their pieces, aiming to challenge black's fianchettoed king's pawn structure. This move develops the bishop to its most potent diagonal, preparing to contest the center and often leading into setups similar to the king's Indian defense, or Pirc defense. This move develops a piece towards the center, aiming to control key squares and prepare for further pawn advances or development of other pieces, solidifying white's central presence initiated by the pawn moves. This move, 3d6, solidifies black's central pawn structure and prepares to develop the kingside knight, typical of a king's Indian defense or Pirc defense setup, aiming for active piece play and potential counterplay in the center. This move develops the knight towards the center, preparing to castle and supporting the d4 pawn, while also discouraging black's common pawn push to e5. This move, nf6, challenges white's central pawn presence and prepares for castling, common in many king's Indian defense setups. This move develops the bishop to a natural square, preparing for kingside castling and reinforcing control over central light squares while avoiding early confrontation with black's fianchettoed bishop. Black castles to safety, a standard defensive maneuver in the king's Indian setup, preparing to connect the rooks and solidify the king's position. This move completes white's kingside development and connects the rooks, reinforcing the center and preparing to contest control of the d4 square. This move, 6bg4, develops the bishop to a useful diagonal, pinning the knight on f3 and implicitly preparing to challenge white's central control. This move solidifies white's central pawn control and prepares to develop the queen's bishop to a more active diagonal, while also potentially supporting a kingside pawn advance. This move develops another piece, preparing to challenge white's central control and offering a flexible setup in the spirit of the king's Indian defense. This move develops the queen to a central square, supporting the knight on c3 and preparing for potential queenside expansion or a rook lift with h3 and rh2. This move immediately challenges white's central pawn structure, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious development and open lines for black's pieces. This move solidifies white's central pawn structure, restricting black's knight mobility and preparing for a kingside attack by gaining space. This move initiates a typical plan in the king's Indian defense's Averbach system, repositioning the knight to a more active square and preparing to challenge white's central pawn chain. Rad1 is a logical developing move, preparing to contest the d-file and potentially support a central pawn push or pressure black's queenside. This move repositions the king to safety behind the pawn chain and away from the open f-file, a common prophylactic measure in this type of setup against potential threats on the kingside. This move challenges the knight on f6, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure or gain a tempo if the knight retreats. This move exchanges a bishop for a knight, which is generally unfavorable in this king's Indian defense structure, but it does temporarily disrupt white's kingside pawn structure by creating doubled f-pawns. This capture on f3 is a positional concession, exchanging a potentially active bishop for a knight, weakening white's kingside pawn structure and opening the g-file for black's rook. This move initiates the knight's redeployment from c6 to d7. aiming to support a future e5 pawn push and prepare for the knight to potentially advance to f6 or b6, contributing to black's central control and potential kingside attack. The bishop retreats to a more flexible square, aiming to redeploy to c4 or d3 to pressure black's central pawn structure. This move initiates a critical pawn break in the center, aiming to challenge white's control of the d5 square and open lines for black's pieces, particularly the queen and rook on the d-file. This move initiates a pawn sacrifice to open lines and create attacking chances against black's kingside, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure after bxf3. This move initiates a queenside pawn expansion, aiming to create space and potentially challenge white's control of the c-file or b4 square, as black's kingside is currently well defended and white has committed to f4. This pawn capture opens the f-file for white's rook and forces black to recapture with the d-pawn, potentially creating an isolated pawn or a backward pawn on d6, which can become a target for white's pieces. This move recaptures the pawn and opens the f-file for white, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside and pressure black's central pawns. This move prepares to activate the rook on the f-file, aiming to create threats against black's kingside and potentially support a central advance with further pawn pushes. This move prepares to redeploy the queen to a more active square, likely to support the pawn push on f5 or to contest the d-file if it opens. This move repositions the rook to the strategically important f-file, reinforcing the potential for kingside pressure and preparing to contest the open file should it arise. This move initiates a central pawn exchange which will open the f-file for white's rook and potentially create weaknesses in black's kingside pawn structure if black recaptures. This move resolves the tension in the center and opens the e-file, creating immediate activity for white's pieces. This rook sacrifice on f2 aims to open the f-file for the other rook and potentially disrupt white's kingside pawn structure after the pawn on e4 is captured. The recapture on f2 by the bishop re-establishes material equality and aims to prevent black's rook from becoming too active on the central files. This move prepares to challenge white's centralized bishop on e3 and potentially open up the h-file for future rook activity. This move prepares to support the advance of the queenside pawns, potentially creating an outpost for a knight on c4 or a pawn break with b4. The rook move to f8 aims to support the pawn break with f5, placing pressure on white's e4 pawn and potentially opening the f-file for further activity. This move reinforces the queenside pawn structure, preparing to expand white's space and potentially launch a queenside attack while solidifying the d5 pawn. This move initiates a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create attacking chances, but it weakens the dark squares around black's king and may overextend. This knight maneuver repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to control central squares and potentially support a kingside attack or defend key weaknesses. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, aiming to pressure white's d5 pawn and potentially support a kingside initiative. This move repositions the bishop, reinforcing the queenside and preparing to support the advance of the a-pawn or contest the c-file. This exchange of rooks on the f-file simplifies the position and removes a key defender from black's king, potentially opening up lines for white's queen and bishops. This capture removes black's active rook and opens the f-file for white's remaining rook, potentially leading to pressure against the black king on the kingside. The move qf7 repositions the queen to a more active square, indirectly supporting the d6 pawn and preparing to challenge white's control of the central dark squares if white's king remains on e1. White centralizes the queen to support the e4 pawn and potentially the kingside, while also preparing to connect the rooks and potentially exploit the open c-file. This move repositions the knight to a more active square on the kingside, aiming to potentially support a kingside pawn push or to be rerouted to a more central outpost if white commits their pieces further. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square on the a7-1 diagonal, aiming to pressure black's queenside and potentially support a queenside advance. The move neg6 aims to reposition the knight to a more active square on g6, supporting the central pawn push and potentially preparing for kingside expansion or regrouping to defend against white's initiative on the queenside. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square on the queenside diagonal, aiming to control key central squares and support potential pawn breaks while also being prepared to defend against black's developing knight on g6. This move, b5, aims to activate the bishop to the center, contesting the e5 square and preparing to support a potential pawn push or pressure black's kingside. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to control the long diagonal and potentially support a kingside advance or exploit weaknesses on the queenside. This move aims to activate the knight by bringing it to a more central outpost, potentially creating attacking chances on the kingside or supporting a pawn advance. This move repositions the bishop to a more active central square, aiming to contest black's control of the d5 square and prepare for potential kingside advances. This move repositioning the queen to f6 aims to increase pressure on white's d3 bishop and prepare potential kingside activity by offering an exchange of queens or reinforcing the g5 pawn. The queen repositions to d1, supporting the potential advance of the d-pawn and preparing to join the queenside attack or defend the king if necessary. The move b6 aims to prepare a queenside expansion with c5, challenging white's central control and opening lines for black's pieces. This move repositions the queen to pressure the g5 pawn and simultaneously aims to exploit the potential weakness on the kingside should black's knight on f4 be forced to move. The move kg7 aims to reposition the king away from the active queen and potentially onto a more secure square on the g-file, while also preparing for potential pawn advances or kingside defense. This move reinforces the knight on g3, prepares to potentially double rooks on the f-file if the opportunity arises, and maintains flexibility for the bishop to redeploy. The king repositions to f7, seeking a more secure central square after the queenside pawn push and preparing to support potential queenside counterplay. This move shifts the queen to a more active central square, aiming to exploit the open c-file and potentially pressure white's queenside pawns while supporting black's central pawn majority. This move seeks to re-centralize the queen and prepare for potential pawn breaks in the center or kingside, while also keeping an eye on white's g3 knight. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to challenge black's central control and potentially create attacking opportunities against the kingside. This knight sacrifice exploits the open g-file and white's exposed king, aiming to disrupt white's defensive setup and potentially initiate a mating attack. Capturing the knight on h3 is a necessary tactical response to prevent the immediate checkmate threat, although it opens up the h-file for black's rook and potentially creates an unstable king position for white.